I'm Giacomo from the Dallara HR's team. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Together with me, there is also Mr. Dialma Zinelli, our Director of Aerodynamics. And last year, we, together with a colleague of us, two colleagues of us, Mrs. Manfredi and Mr. Burzoni, we have a talk about the history of Dallara, about how we are organized and what services we could bring to our clients. This year, we want to dig a little deeper in one of our core competencies, which is aerodynamics. And for doing that, we have decided to show you something about the development of this discipline. And that's enough. So, Dialma.
So, good afternoon, everybody. Also for me, obviously, it's a great pleasure being here and showing you something about the history of the aerodynamic and its role in the past and now on the four-wheel vehicles. So in particular, I would like to start from the motorsport to move then to the automotive. So how the aerodynamic as a discipline, as application, has been, let's say, treated over the time, over the decades, from the beginning of the races or at the beginning of the automotive history up to now. So, may I start? My name is Dialma Zinelli. I am Director of Aero in Dallara. And as a first start, I would like just to, let's say, just to start from something, for some physics, but don't worry, this will be the only slide with some physics behind. I have to start from, let's say, the aerodynamic forces. So for any car moving in the flow, you perfectly know that we have an aerodynamic effect, an aerodynamic force that is looking upwards, that is normally looking upwards for the road vehicles, that is surely looking downwards for the racing car. And obviously, the two components, the horizontal and the vertical components, are drag, the horizontal component that is always opposing the car motion, and the vertical component that is lift, that so is always, or 99.9% of the cases, looking upwards for the normal road car, is 100% and surely looking downwards for the racing car. Obviously, this force is depending from the shape of the car, from the cross-section, for the flow characteristic and the square of the velocity. But now let's move to the vehicles. It's funny if we think that at the origin, between the first vehicle, the Carl-Benz car, and the Wright brothers plane, there's not so much time. It's just a question of 10 years. But behind there is a completely different management of the aerodynamic. I mean that on the airplane, obviously, everything must be controlled. So it was fully clear the effect of the aero on the vehicle dynamic. While on the automotive world, the application of the aerodynamic has been, let's say, limited for long time, I would say 50, 60 years, just on one of the two components of the aerodynamic force, the drag. So the application of the aerodynamic on the car leave for long time, this both in the motorsport scenario as well as in the automotive scenario, just working on the drag. So just having the objective, apart the cooling issue, obviously, but in terms of performance, just having as a pure target the top speed. This is the reason why over the years, over the decades, and starting from the beginning of last century, the car had this shape. So if open wheel car, we had a sort of cigars with 4 wheels at the corner, just looking at the drag reduction. This is the case of the Bugatti rather than the Maserati of 35 or Lancia D50. It's interesting, this case of the Lancia D50, because the fairing that the body, which is a fairing behind the front and rear wheel, was in reality a tank. So the concept of the safety was so low, and the application of the safety on the car, on the racing car, was so low that you had the fuel exactly where it does not convenient having a fuel. But this was another example to show you how strong was the mission of the drag decrease. In the family of the cover wheel cars, obviously we have a fantastic and extremely, I would say, artistic examples of streamlined car, like that Mercedes of 44 rather than the Audi Type C streamline. But going on with this example and moving to Le Mans, for instance, the Jaguar D-Type, Ferrari Testarossa is another extraordinary example, Abarth 1000 rather than the Alpine GT car for Le Mans, and we are already on the 60s. But can you recognize something that can be related to the vertical force, to the vertical aerodynamic force? No, nothing. And we are already in the 60s. And the first race is end of 18 or let's say 19th century or beginning of last century. So even after 50 or 60 years, the mission in the aerodynamic application was just drag reduction. Then someone had the idea that, let's say, putting a wing, reverse wing with respect to the airplane on the car, something may happen. Chaparral 66, and in F1, Lotus, Ferrari, and then all the others. The funny thing is that there was at the beginning, you can see, this strange rear wing, huge, height, and you can imagine in terms of drivability of the car, in terms of handling, which the final effect could be, because obviously you were putting a lot downforce on the rear axle and basically nothing or very poor downforce on the front. So the balance that is now in the car performance, the aero balance that is now in the car performance, such a big issue, in that case was absolutely not an issue. So in terms of handling, I can imagine that the effort of the drivers at the time could be not easy. Then moving towards the 70s, the story of the wings became more, I would say, balanced with, let's say, more research of a correct aero balance. So in this case, you can see 3 examples of F1, Ferrari, Tyrrell, and Lotus with some sort of balance research in terms of aero. And these, let's say, moved up to the mid of the 70s, more or less. I remember Ferrari 312T, the world championship with Niki Lauda, 75, 76. This was, on the aerodynamic point of view, a car based on the wings. There was no research on the underfloor. But, let's say, the value of this application was coming from the fact that lap time was improving if not only looking, let's say, at the drag reduction, but looking also at the vertical component of the aerodynamic force. This was, let's say, the big advantage of the wing application. But a few years later, a big step up has been done with the underfloor of the car. So Colin Chapman at the beginning discovered that there was in theory nothing to be discovered, because the Venturi tube and this application was clear for a long time. But I mean, the application on the car showed that the most efficient way to produce downforce and in consequence car efficiency and in consequence lap time improvement was not coming from the wings, but the underfloor. This was the most efficient way to get, let's say, efficiency out and performance out of the car. So at the second half of the 70s, the wing car were, let's say, dominating the technical scenario, and all, let's say, the car package and the car engineering was basically driven by this car layout, by this car architecture, having two Venturi tubes at the side, on the side pod of the car. And sometimes, since the regulation was, let's say, not so rigid as it is now, on the technical point of view, I mean, and sometimes you had some funny application. The rear fan that Brabham with Niki Lauda used in Understop 76. Niki Lauda won this Grand Prix having this fan behind the car. So since that Brabham was already done, was already, let's say, on the ground without Venturi tube, the idea behind was, let's say, having a fan behind in order to have more suction on the underfloor. And the effect was absolutely fantastic. The car won that race. Then it was put out of rule because it was, let's say, extremely dangerous in case of, let's say, having some stones directly on the helmet of the car or the following car. But this just to show you how, let's say, the fantasy could at that time explore the field of the downforce generation from the ground effect. Honestly speaking, on the engineering point of view, the understanding behind and the complete comprehension of the phenomena was not so high. This brought the limit too high in the car performance, and we had some disaster, I would say, some important crisis. One, for probably the most important, was the crash that Patrick Depailler with Alfa Romeo, 1st of August of the 80, had in Hockenheim, and he died in this crash. This was, let's say, I would say the no-return moment, because all the community, all the motorsport community, the technical community realized that something had to be done in order to limit the performance of the car. And the ground effect coming from the Venturi tube was banned, moving the car layout towards the flat floor. The point was that the path, the road map was already setted, basically. So all the technical community was completely aware that the most convenient way to get performance out of the car was, let's say, the study of the underfloor. Was no more a question of the front and rear wing. And the improvement, even with the flat floor of the performance, was so strong and so high that once more and again, the aero became the real driver of the car engineering. I can remember the active suspension, which was the reason behind of the active suspension, was, let's say, to keep the car in the most efficient setup, in the most efficient ride height. So all the car, but not only all the car, let's say, architecture, but all the handling of the car was driven by the aero. And as a consequence, since the understanding and the study behind, the tools behind, I would say, first of all, was not so powerful, the quickest way to get performance out was, let's say, to keep the car as rigid as possible in the most efficient ride height, in the most efficient rake. This brought in a very, very quick time, again, to very dangerous situation, up to Imola 94. Imola 94, 1st of May, and that weekend, all that weekend, was one of the worst page for the motorsport. We had that crash with Barrichello on Friday. We had Roland Ratzenberger's crash and he died on Saturday, and we had Ayrton Senna crash and he died on Sunday. After that weekend, everyone realized that the flat floor, again, was not the way to go on. And the performance of the car was drastically limited with the introduction of the stepped floor, stepped cross-section of the floor. At the time, I remember that it was a question between 25 and 30% of downforce loss with this application. And let's say, apart from the open wheel car, what on the endurance races was happening? Finally, nothing so different, because the study of the underfloor was improving more and more, with the additional problem that on this car, that are normally in terms of sizing 5 meter long per 2 meter of width, you have nearly 10 square meter surface close to the ground. So the amplification of the aerodynamic effect coming from any action that you may do on the underfloor is even bigger. So it's much quicker, let's say, eventually the lose of control. If something is dangerous, in this case, is becoming more quickly and more dangerous. And in fact, even with the flat floor, I have the example of the Mercedes crash in Le Mans.
The Toyota lights ablaze.
We face this problem.
Sure the slower cars see them. Here we go. Oh my God! Oh my God! The Mercedes has taken off. That's Peter Dumbreck at the wheel of the number 5 Mercedes. The car
this was an
right
aerodynamic effect. This was a stall. The
and
front
the
end of the
Look at
car
this again.
with the
This
bump
is an awful accident. An
moved
awful
to
accident.
under pressure
Out
to
of the
compression,
slipstream of the Toyota, and the car just takes off. That looks
and the car
horrifically like a replay of what happened to Mark
flight
Webber,
was
who I hasten to add
this one.
That's a big impact. Look at the earth thrown up. That
It's unbelievable, because Mercedes had in the weekend 3 of these crash, and for all the times, no problem at all for the driver. So, and if you, I've been there, it's unbelievable, because somewhere something had to happen because you have all the trees, you have a lot of things. It's unbelievable if you think that all the 3 times there was no consequence for the driver. Extremely lucky situation. Alboreto was not so lucky, unfortunately, in Lausitzing in 01. In this case, the rear wheel puncture made the car rolled and yawed, and the combination of this small angle of roll and yaw made the car flying. There was, to be honest, at that time, I was part of the technical committee after this crash, and very seriously and very honestly speaking, there was no technical understanding, absolutely not, regarding the reason that made the car flying. Absolutely not. We discovered then that this combination of angle can cause serious stall on the underfloor of the car, and as a consequence, let's say the complete fly of the car. The car may take off. Then Michele was particularly unlucky because he landed on the field and not on the asphalt, because in case of landing on the asphalt, probably he would be here. But anyway, this to say that also on the endurance car, the limit was reached. And as a consequence of the technical action that followed this crash and Michele's die, there was another limitation also on the flat floor that moved the technical community to look for downforce on the upper part of the body. And sometimes we can discover some Christmas tree, I would say, in the motorsport. The Ferrari, the Raikkonen's Ferrari, the world champions of 7, you can see how many add-on parts are populating the top part of the body, as well in the DTM, the same. The micro aerodynamic was so detailed to generate a lot of add-on parts, a lot of flicks, a lot of small wings, just to find on the top part of the body the downforce that was no more coming from the underfloor. This coming from the technical regulation. This in the past. And now, which is the profile of the aerodynamic project? I have to say that now in the motorsport, there are at least 4 variables, 4 main items that are driving the aerodynamic project. One is the performance, obviously, the one that all the time, F1 performed. The style, you may believe or not, but the style is sometimes present and sometimes heavily present in the car design, the motorsport, obviously. And the raceability and overtaking is another important parameter, and the stability. As I told you before, F1 lived most part of his history on the performance. Sometimes the style, like in the Formula E, is the main driver of the car body design. Sometimes it's the overtaking. The last F1 regulation is the, I would say, clear example of the raceability driver. And I say raceability and not overtaking. Raceability is the capacity of the car of racing close. If the cars can race close, maybe that the overtake occurs. The overtaking in itself is always based on DRS, unfortunately. But the precondition to overtake is that the car may race close. And this condition is, let's say, guaranteed by a strong study that FIA did in order to promote this new technical regulation and to promote these here, I would say, F1 aero characteristics. Stability, in terms of stability now, I mean anti-takeoff capacity. Sometimes on the ovals and in Le Mans and the endurance, the problem, the risk of taking off is extremely high. What do I mean when I say the car, one of the car problem is the takeoff? I can show you two examples. One is Dario Franchitti in the IndyCar.
Franchitti et Weldon qui restent côte à côte depuis un bon moment maintenant. Oh là 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 là, quel accident incroyable! Oh, Franchitti! Oh là là, la voiture s'est envolée. Aïe 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 aïe, des images qu'on redoute toujours en IndyCar. Touchette avec.
The other one is always in Indy, Helio Castroneves. This is 015, if I well remember. The car is crashing, and when at 180 degrees, it takes off. Which is the problem on the aerodynamic point of view? Is, let's say, to predict and to shape the correct car body in terms of limiting the overturning moment. So it's not more a question of, let's say, a design that has to improve the car performance. In this case, we have to limit the takeoff, and this is a completely different story. But we are always talking about aero, and behind there is always the same physics. So F1 basically starting from the pure performance research moved also in recent time more and more towards, let's say, style, because in this case you had, let's say, larger tires, you had a lower rear wing, you had a delta shape wings, front wing, that was not, and the reason was not, let's say, the performance, was style. And now the F1 is based, the technical regulation is based on raceability. Then in this perimeter of raceability, there is a strong performance research. So once the new regulation has been set last year, then the study was basically driven by the performance. But now the contents of this car on the aero point of view are not limited to the pure performance, are related also to the raceability and, let's say, overtaking capacity. The IndyCar is, I would say, has always been more, I would say, was including more parameters. So all along its history, the performance was not the only item in the aerodynamic research, because the raceability has always been one of the most important elements to judge the quality of the race. In Indy and on the ovals, the number of overtakes in the race is one of the first and most important parameters to judge the quality of the race. The stability in terms of anti-takeoff capacity already was born in the USA and on the ovals at Indy, because this car, we did this car in 2011, studying the car in CFD at 90 degrees. This car has been studied for 1 year, I would say, at 90. Then we moved to the wind tunnel, testing the car straight. But the strange shape of that body is coming as a reason for the study, from the study at 90 degrees. And that strange shape had to generate, let's say, a aerodynamic moment to keep the car down when at 90, or at least at a big yaw angle. Now, the current car generation of the IndyCar, I think that is one of the most important example of global aerodynamic project, because it's including all these items. There is performance, there is style, there is raceability, there is stability. When we will have to do the next car generation, this benchmark will represent, I am sure, a very difficult benchmark. We have to improve that car, obviously. This is part of the game, but it will not be an easy game at all. The endurance world is moving more and more towards these different parameters, because it's no more a question of pure performance. Now the homologation of the car is driven also from the style committee. And since the style is not a number, this styling committee has to judge the branding, so the coherence of the styling feature that you have on the car. So the homologation is no more a question of, let's say, BOP, of the balance of performance. It's also a question of style. But in addition, there is also the anti-takeoff, because we have to respect anti-takeoff parameter of this car, because this car, together with the IndyCar on the ovals, may suffer from the risk of taking off. Because on the straight in Le Mans, when at 320, if let's say you lose the car, the problem of takeoff may occur. And this is the examples of the last LMDH car or LMA. So Porsche, BMW, Cadillac, Acura, in particular BMW and Acura are coming from a Dallara chassis. In terms of LMH, Toyota, Ferrari, Peugeot. So basically, Glickenhaus. So basically, I would say that all the motorsport scenario is moving towards a more global interpretation of the aerodynamic project. And on the automotive point of view, what did happen over the time? The drag reduction was also on the automotive the main driver for long time, and is still, for different reasons. The first reason to, let's say, carry on a lot of research. The point is that 60 years ago, with the wonderful Alfa Romeo Giulia, one extraordinary example of a well-done car in terms of aero, the mission was the top speed. With that kind of surface treatment and tail, you can gain 5-8 kilometers per hour. Now the mission is, let's say, the drag reduction for CO2 emission or autonomy of the battery in case of e-car. This is the evolution of the drag reduction, starting from the 40 to the actual time, so moving from the Fiat Balilla through the new Beetle, through the Mini and Giulia and so on, to the concept. This is the roadmap that you have in front of us, at least in terms of thermal engine. So the main mission of the drag reduction is this one, is the limitation of the CO2 emission. And this is the relationship between the aerodynamic and the drag. So basically, and the aerodynamic and the CO2 emission. So basically, it's clear that there is a strong relationship between CO2 emission and aerodynamic and drag reduction. Drag reduction is one of the three levers that the big OEMs have to match the target. So aerodynamic, lightweighting, and powertrain. The point is that the problem is that on the automotive point of view that, okay, this is the mission, this is the target, but this is unfortunately the picture of the market. So I mean, you can see the CD or the CDS with respect the distribution in the car selling. The 50%, so one car over two, is an SUV or a crossover. So it means 30% more in lightweighting and 30% more in cross-section. So you can see that on the technical point of view, we are able with the sedan cars to reach with such a strong research, very good level of CDS, of drag reduction. The point is that this part of the market is 4-5%. 50% is SUV. So personally, I think that the problem, this equation, the solution of this equation is a bit difficult. And on the high performance car, this car, that are the car that we are making here in the Motor Valley, are emotional cars, where, let's say, the style, the homologation constraints are very, very strong. Sometimes in the aero project of this car, you have more freedom. For instance, the budget, the low cost is not such a big issue, but other reasons are, let's say, strongly limiting in the project. Style, first of all, because this must be an emotional product. Homologation is another reason. The ramp angle front and rear, the step, the car layout, because finally these products are still industrial products. So with all the limitation in terms of package, in terms of radiator layout, in terms of powertrain layout, because finally, okay, in this car you may have an underfloor, an aero underfloor, but the suspension, the powertrain, the radiator layout is limiting in any case your aero design. And the cooling in this car is absolutely a very, very strong issue. This because of the power of the engine. This because of the power of the braking. This because you need to cool a lot of, let's say, functionality. And finally, the cooling is strongly limiting not only the performance, but in terms of project, the layout of the car. As opportunity, in this case, we have to play with the active aero devices. So the active devices are, in this case, let's say, usable because the budget is not such a strong issue. So let's say that from 100,000 euro on, you may find more and more active devices on this car. So finally, which is the conclusion? The conclusion is that the evolution of the aerodynamic in motorsport has been, I would say, clear, with a strong drag reduction research at the beginning and a stronger downforce research in the year later. Now, the aerodynamic project is more global, including a lot of items, sometimes limited in terms of budget, as in the past was limited in terms of safety. On the automotive point of view, the main consideration is that the market is moving more and more towards a dual scenario. On one side, the daily car that are, let's say, addressed to the mobility, urban, extra-urban mobility, where, let's say, the connection, the assistance in driving, all these items are the main actors of the engineering of the car. And the aerodynamic is one of the levers that the manufacturer has to match the target in terms of CO2 emission or autonomy of the battery. There is a very limited niche of the market, and these are the cars that we are making in Motor Valley, that are emotional products, that are styling products, that are made for the pleasure of driving, for the pleasure of looking a beautiful car. In this car, the aerodynamic is, for other reason, completely different reason, an important and fundamental parameter, and also in the future will be a fundamental parameter. Thank you. If you have any question, it's a pleasure.
Thank you. I would like to ask about active aerodynamics. I like that you bring this to our attention because it's a nice topic to talk about. And my question is, why don't we still see a big breakthrough in that field, like a big innovation? We see some active airfoils, something is trying with aerovectoring, but why don't?
Now, the point is that there are a lot of tools that can be activated. The point, the main reason, because this is still not a democratic tool, is that this is bringing cost and weight to the car. And up to a certain level of the market, the car cost is a sort of cost per kilo, like the potatoes. So basically, unless the manufacturer on one side and the market on the other side is not improving a different, let's say, feeling and awareness, it's difficult the application, the democratic application of this tool on the car that is costing 20,000 euro. And this is just a question of configuration, because finally, when you are going to configure the car, you have a list full of useful and not useful tools. The heater of the seat or whatever. Is the cost of the heater of the seater comparable with the active aero? Probably yes. The point is that the manufacturer on one side and the market on the other side, and the client on the other side, is not mature enough to substitute some unuseful tool with aerodynamic, with the active aerodynamic, that is one of the few tools that can find the compromise between the style and the function. When in parking condition, so the style, you see the car body that the stylist would like to see. When in running, the performance is the performance that the engineer would like to have. This, unfortunately, is the reason why it's a philosophical approach, I would say. This is the main reason why the application of the active aero is from, let's say, I put a number, 100,000 on. From that point on, it's quite easy. And I can guarantee you that you may have a lot of examples of active aero. Unfortunately, on top class cars.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, talking about the regulations in the motorsport. We see in the recent times, for example, in F1, that the regulation were strictly constricting in a certain way the technological development and also the capability of the different teams to develop different ways to reach the performance. So we now see one dominant car, for example, and one dominant way of thinking of the regulation. In your opinion, so is this current regulation too much strictly technically restricting of the techniques, or are they necessary in order, as we saw before, in order to not get the safety in a warning zone?
With respect this car generation, this F1 generation, let's say that there was initially, I find a lot of coherence in putting on the top the raceability. And I can guarantee you that FIA, with his head of aero, Nicolas Tombasis, did a very good job in this respect. The study, the research has been, let's say, strong, deep, and well done. And the car initially, you saw that last year, there was in fact much more condition and examples of, let's say, close racing. Having said that, the freedom probably that has been left on the underfloor was so high that the performance is now much higher than expected. There was initially, last year, an expectation of a performance reduction by a certain, let's say, level. In reality, on the starting part of the season, the performance was already on the same level of, let's say, the other car generation. Now the performance has improved a lot. The purposing was not something out of any logic. It's extremely strange that I would say probably 2,000 engineers putting everything together fall down in this kind of problem. The F1 is, let's say, the pinnacle of the technical research in automotive, no? And more or less everyone last year had this problem. This problem became from, let's say, basically two reasons. Too much downforce, level of downforce, and the flexibility on the structural point of view of the surfaces, of the materials. So let's say again, the performance research was too much, or the research was too much oriented, or the freedom probably was too high in the technical regulation. The performance was finally higher, and sometimes, and now especially, much higher than expected. So probably I think that we are facing some rebalance of the performance. It may happen soon, because now the aero performance is really higher than the expectation was.
Thank you.
In terms of aero, then the lap time is depending from a lot of other things, so weight and so on. But in terms of performance aero, now the performance is higher.
Hi. I'm here. Good afternoon. Two questions. The first one, how much large eddy simulations are used in F1 or sports car nowadays? And second question, how much is important the understanding of scales of turbulence in the developing of a car?
What do you mean, which kind of simulation? In terms of CAD?
Yes, large eddy simulations.
I have to say that I'm answering speaking on the, let's say, overall, the overall scenario of the motorsport. I'm not talking about the specific. For the computational capacity that we are normally using in the industry, I have to say that the most part of the development is run with steady simulation, leaving the unsteady simulation and the physics that has to be treated with unsteady simulation. I don't say limited, but let's say it's not the daily job, the unsteady simulation. What I would like to underline is the heavy and let's say increasing importance of the simulation within the aerodynamic study. And it's just because of it that we now may approach so much different problems. The problems of the overtaking, the problem of the raceability, the problem of the takeoff, without, let's say, the CFD and this massive, intensive use of the simulation would be not possible, as simple as that. Now, we are living an historical time where you must, let's say, get the best from each one of the tools, from, let's say, the simulation, the mathematical model on one side and the physical model in the wind tunnel in the other side. But I can guarantee you that if now we have much more awareness about the physics around the car, this is thanks to the simulation. The second question was?
How much is important the understanding of scales of turbulence in the development?
Yes, it's important. Obviously, it's important. That is a lot depending from the study that you are carrying on and the physics that you are studying.
Thank you.
Hi. Regarding developing of your CFD model and validation of it, and you do some wind tunnel testing, when you see that maybe your results are different from your model,
Sorry?
different, you have some errors, which is the way the path you have to choose in order to try to be closer to the real datas, I mean, wind tunnel datas?
Nice and correct question, because this is, let's say, the real critical point of the story, because the performance finally is not coming from the best wind tunnel, the performance is not coming from the best cluster, the performance is coming basically from the best or let's say a good level of correlation that you may produce. So let's say that you have to concentrate most part of your effort in let's say make these two talking together, otherwise you're lost. And it's extremely important that the real life when you put your car on the ground, you have to carry on a systematic campaign of, let's say, aero measurement. So the full-scale testing is in the process extremely important to validate any step of the models behind. Because finally, we have two models, a mathematical model in CFD and a physical model in the wind tunnel. Unfortunately, since the CFD was, let's say, an improving discipline, and the wind tunnel had, let's say, 1 century of history behind, with some awareness, the wind tunnel for a long time has been considered the benchmark. This is not. We are considering two models that are not the real life. So you have to make your full testing as strong as possible, and this is the only way to validate the process that you have behind in CFD on one side and the wind tunnel on the other side. Then there are some specific questions where you prefer to consider, in case of mismatching the results, one or the other. But the big question behind is that the full-scale testing is absolutely essential. This for validation and correlation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.